Okay, good morning. I'm Douglas Streusand of the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, of course speaking only for myself, not for my employer. Welcome to this panel on perspectives on Arabian religion and politics. Given that the panels that I have organized the last several years have had attendance of approximately this amount, I think that I'd like to put forward the proposition that the quality of the panels is in inverse proportion to the size of the audience. And certainly, I know personally that we're going to have a series of 3 extremely stimulating presentations, which actually are in interesting contrast to some of the observations that we heard in this room yesterday about the influence of Western totalitarian ideas on the ideology of Islamism. I prefer to call it totalitarian Islamism. And today we're looking at the tradition of political activism that, in my interpretation, fused with Western totalitarian thought to form the modern ideology of totalitarian Islamism. So our first speaker is Cole Bunzel of the Hoover Institution, where I sat 35 years ago. And he is a historian of the Arabian Peninsula, Islamic theology, and modern Islamic radicalism, and has just come out with a history of Wahhabism, the history of a militant Islamic movement, Princeton University Press, 2023. If your coffee has kicked in, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you to my co-panelists for being on this, what is it called? Perspectives on Arabian religion and culture or politics. I'm talking about something that might sound a little obscure based on the title, the concept of al-ʿudhr bi-l-jahl in Salafī Islam. And perhaps I should have made it clear that what I'm really talking about is the concept of takfir. That is, there we go, to declare someone to be an unbeliever, a kafir. So Salafism and al-ʿudhr bi-l-jahl is essentially a concept that is used by those who are inclined to pronounce takfir on other sorts of Muslims. It's a restraint. It basically says that somebody who is jahl, who is ignorant of the kind of polytheistic act or belief that they are being alleged of committing, that they can be excused on the basis of their ignorance and thereby shielded from takfir. So that's kind of the whole premise of what I'm talking about. But I should make clear the other term that I'm talking about that's in the title is Salafī Islam. There has been debate among scholars in the West about what Salafī Islam really means. Does it apply to the reformist movement of Jamaluddin Afghani, Muhammad ʿAbd, Rashid Ridda in Egypt, this kind of modernist approach to Sunni Islam? And I think that for most Muslims who adhere to a tradition that they call Salafi, what they are really referring to is the intellectual tradition that goes back to Ibn Taymiyya. Ibn Taymiyya was a 13th and 14th century Hanbali theologian and jurist. He lived primarily in Damascus and in Egypt, and he did not believe that the kind of main institutions of Islam as they existed at the time reflected the teachings of the Salaf, of the first 3 generations of Muslims. And his entire ideological project was to try to recapture the ethos of the Salaf, what he called the madhhab as-Salaf, the the way of the ancestors or the doctrine of the ancestors. And so he basically, with a great, and he was really a genius. He wrote at length on numerous issues, from philosophy to theology to law. But what he's most famous for, and what his legacy in the modern world is kind of known for, is having created something that really is a puritanical strain in Sunni Islam that's aimed at purifying the religion of perceived un-Islamic accretions, particularly those seen as shirk. So he dies in 1328. He has a very famous student, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, who there are some who would argue he is really an original thinker. I think he's a Taymiyyan thinker. He takes some of Ibn Taymiyya's ideas and sort of retools them. He's a beautiful writer. And then the next person I'll be talking about in the Salafi tradition is a man named Muhammad ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhāb, who lived in the 18th century and was the founder of the movement known as Wahhabism, which is the subject of the book that I recently published. And so Wahhabism you can think of as kind of a subset of the larger puritanical Salafi movement. That's sort of to give everyone the sort of terms that I'm working with. So takfir was something that was very much, at the very least, implicit in a lot of the writings of Ibn Taymiyya, particularly when it came to the subject of what we call in Western academia the cult of saints, which were the practices of devotion associated with visiting the tombs and shrines of those seen as either prophets or holy men and asking them for certain favors. One of these terms is called istighatha, asking the dead for some sort of worldly favor, help with travel, protection, that sort of thing. That was what Ibn Taymiyya was very, very concerned about, that these were very prominent practices in the Islamic world at the time, and he polemicized vehemently against them. So these are just two examples of him doing so. Those who call upon prophets and righteous men after their death, at their graves and elsewhere, are among the polytheists who call upon other than God. Whosoever sets up the angels and prophets as intermediaries, calling on them, relying on them, and asking them to bestow benefits and alleviate harms, is an unbeliever according to the consensus of the Muslims. So very much implicit here is a concept of takfir, of declaring Muslims who do these things at grave sites to be unbelievers. It's implicit, but as I will show shortly, it's not necessarily literal. It shouldn't necessarily be taken literally, because of the concept of al-ʿudhr bil-jahl. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was famous for repeating many of these lines by Ibn Taymiyya. So one of his most famous lines that comes from an epistle called the Nullifiers of Islam, Nawaqid al-Islam, which are 10. One of these is, whosoever sets up intermediaries between himself and God, calling on them, asking them for intercession, and relying on them, has disbelieved as a matter of consensus. And this he has just taken almost word for word from Ibn Taymiyya. So al-ʿudhr bil-jahl, while it is very much a concept that is discussed in the Salafi tradition, and I should mention here too that there really is almost no work that's been done among Western scholars of Islam on this issue. You can find books aplenty in Riyadh and elsewhere in Saudi Arabia and other places in the Islamic world discussing this issue, but there's, to my knowledge, only about one article that discusses it. I discuss it in my book, and some of this is adopted from my recent book. But it is important to understand that it does have antecedents in other elements of the Islamic tradition. So as I said, al-ʿudhr bil-jahl means to excuse on the basis of ignorance. Related to the concept of al-ʿudhr bil-jahl is something called iqāmat al-ḥujja, or presenting the proof. So the idea is that if there is someone who is jahil, who is ignorant, before you can pronounce takfir on that person, you have to present the proof, iqāmat al-ḥujja. The proof being the verses of the Quran or statements of the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, basically showing what you are doing is against Islam. And once the proof has been presented to that person, and if they insist on being a mushrik, on a polytheist, then that is when you can declare takfir on them. But as I show, there are other Muslim scholars before Ibn Taymiyya, before the Salafi tradition, who discussed this concept. And one of them was Tabari, the famous exegete from the 10th century. So commenting on the verse, we never chastise until we send forth a messenger, meaning we don't basically condemn someone to hell and burn them there until we send forth a messenger. Tabari says, God says in these words, we never destroy a people until after we have sent forth messengers and have presented the proof to them in the form of the signs that vitiate their excuse. So this concept doesn't just begin with the Salafis. That's important to understand. So going back to Ibn Taymiyya, and one of the arguments that I'm making in this paper is that there is a major difference between Ibn Taymiyya, who is a kind of Salafi icon, and Muhammad ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhāb, who is the eponym of the Wahhabi movement. And the basic distinction is that Ibn Taymiyya believes that al-ʿudhr bi-l-jahl should apply to Muslims who are engaged in the cult of saints, if they are ignorant. So here's a quote, and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab does not. So here's a quote from Ibn Taymiyya where he makes this quite clear. This shirk, and he's talking in particular about grave worship as he understands it, if the proof of it is presented to him and he does not desist from it, then he must be killed as the likes of him among the polytheists are to be killed. He is not to be buried in the cemeteries of Muslims, and he is not to be prayed over. But if he is ignorant, jahl, that's my emphasis, knowledge not having reached him, and he does not know the truth about the shirk, that was, shirk, I should make clear, is polytheism, if I didn't say that before. That was the basis upon which the Prophet fought the polytheists, then he is not to be judged an unbeliever, especially since this shirk has become widespread among those affiliated with Islam. So what he's saying is that it's the abundance of shirk, of these polytheistic practices around grave sites that we have today, which leads us to the point where we have to use al-ʿudhr bi-l-jahl, lest we pronounce takfir on all of these lay Muslims who are visiting graves. Now, fast forward to Ibn Abd al-Wahhab in the 18th century. This is his most famous statement about this concept, which gets repeated in the Wahhabi tradition for centuries, is a letter to two men who are refraining from takfir of those who venerate some of the saints in Central Arabia. So one thing that Ibn Abd al-Wahhab did is he would communicate with his followers, he would write letters, he would write epistles, and in some cases, he would write epistles to people who, in his view, were not following his teachings to the letter. And that included not pronouncing takfir on those who, according to the Wahhabis, were very clearly engaged in polytheistic acts of grave visitation. So he says in this letter to the two men in Najd and he says, you're using the concept of al-ʿudhr bi-l-jahl, but it doesn't actually apply. So he said there are three categories of people who are to be excused on the basis of ignorance. Someone who is very new to Islam, who just converted. Someone who grew up in a remote desert. Basically, someone who grew up on a desert island. That's what he means. Someone whose shirk, polytheism, concerns an obscure matter. And as an example, he talks about, I think, certain forms of sorcery. But, he says, when it comes to the foundations of the religion, usul ad-din, that God clarifies and establishes in his book, that is the Quran. God's proof is the Quran. So anyone it has reached, the proof has reached. Their unbelief occurs upon its reaching them. If they do not understand it, that is another matter. So basically, he is saying that there is the people who have received the Quran, basically anyone who has had access to the Quran, who has listened to the Quran, who has been taught the Quran, that is the proof. Iqamat al-hujjah, the idea of presenting the proof, has already taken place. And for that reason, al-ʿudhr bi-l-jahl is inadmissible. There is no ዑذر bil-jahl when it comes to shirk. That is the essential difference between Ibn Taymiyya and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. For Ibn Taymiyya, al-ዑذر bil-jahl applies to people who are ostensibly committing shirk. For Ibn Abdul Wahhab, it does not, because pretty much anyone in the Islamic world who is visiting shrines and committing grave visitation, polytheism as he understands it, those people have been exposed to the Quran. And it doesn't matter if they don't understand the Quran, they just had to have it reach them. So this is a major distinction. Now modern, I'm having trouble with this. There's one other aspect of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's takfir which will come up shortly in this discussion, that refers to what one scholar has called secondary takfir, the idea that you have to pronounce takfir on those who do not pronounce takfir on the polytheists. It's kind of a radical idea. So he says in one of his famous epistles, whosoever does not pronounce takfir on the polytheists, or is doubtful about their unbelief, or affirms the validity of their doctrine, is an unbeliever by consensus. And this can lead, and has led, and I'll show in a moment how it has, to some very serious disputes between Salafis who regard somebody who does not pronounce takfir on someone to, at the very least, be problematic in their faith. All right, let me move on. So when it came to the Saudi religious establishment as it developed in the 20th century, the way that the Mufti, Muhammad bin Ibrahim, and I talk about this in the paper, he wrote about this concept of al-ʿudhr bi-l-jahl, and later after him, Abdulaziz bin Baz, the next Mufti in the kingdom, and the head of something called the Lajna ad-Da'ima, the Permanent Committee for Fatwa and Research. They basically adhere to the idea that Ibn Abd al-Wahhāb talked about in his writings, that there is no ʿudhr bi-l-jahl when it comes to shirk. So they were against the Taymiyyan approach, and they adhered to the more fierce puritanical approach. And this is even as the Wahhabi religious establishment was really, in my opinion at least, toned down in its approach to pronouncing takfir on other Muslims. In theory, however, they continued to adhere to this teaching. So these are just some examples that I took from the large fatwa collection of the Permanent Committee for Fatwa and Research. That I think that these fatwas are written probably in the 80s and 90s. No one is excused for not knowing the foundations and principles of Islam on grounds of ignorance, who has been reached by the Quran and the mission of the Messenger. So if you have been, this is the same idea. If you have been exposed to the Quran, then there's no excuse for not knowing the foundations of the religion, usul ad-din, and therefore you are not shielded from takfir. Another quote: the legally competent person, that is somebody known as mukallaf in Islamic law, is not excused his worshipping what is apart from God unless he is in a non-Muslim land and has not been reached by the call, the da'wah of Islam. He is excused in that case for not having been reached, not on grounds of ignorance. A person is not excused on grounds of ignorance with regard to the foundations of the religion. So one way they tried to kind of soften this approach was to say that if somebody grew up somewhere where Islam really wasn't practiced correctly, you could argue that they hadn't actually been reached by the call of Islam, but they maintained the position that there was no ʿudhr bi-l-jahl when it came to shirk, when it came to the usul ad-din, the foundations of the religion. Now, there's one other concept that they take on. Remember, I mentioned the issue of secondary takfir, of those who do not pronounce takfir on those perceived as mushrikeen. And it's clear that the Lajna ad-Da'ima, the official religious establishment, is concerned about this practice. And they take the position that those who do not pronounce takfir on the kind of waiver, on those who are, we could say, failing in their duty to pronounce takfir, that we can give them a pass. We can excuse them on the basis of ignorance because they have something called a shubha. It is not permitted for those who declare the unbelief of grave worshippers to pronounce takfir on their brethren who refrain from declaring their unbelief until the proof has been presented to them. This is because they're refraining, this is tawaqquf in Arabic, from pronouncing takfir on them is informed by a misconception, shubha, which is their belief in the necessity of presenting the proof to those grave worshippers before they are declared unbelievers. So in this way, they're kind of trying to make sure that there are no takfir wars among Salafis in Saudi Arabia. There has to be peace if there are people who don't want to pronounce takfir on those who are visiting shrines because perhaps they adhere to Ibn Taymiyya's approach. We don't want, internecine conflict over this. How much time do I have? Only 2 minutes. Wow. Okay. So I will be brief. So one thing that is I followed in some of my studies with regard to the jihadi movement, that is the movement associated with al-Qaeda and ISIS, and I should explain that this movement is very much infused by the Salafi tradition, and particularly the more hardcore ideas that come out of Wahhabism. And when you had this dispute between al-Qaeda and ISIS beginning in 2013, 2014, one of the ways that it was framed, at least internally, by ISIS was over the concept of al-ʿudhr bi-l-jahl. This is Turkī bin Ali, who would become sort of the chief mufti of ISIS, a young Bahraini man. He's dead now, rahimahullah, not really. He said in a leaked audio that most of the sheikhs of al-Qaeda, they excuse on the basis of ignorance, and he mentioned Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda. Because of this, there emerged a divergence between them and the Islamic State. We do not excuse on the basis of ignorance, but we do excuse the one who excuses on the basis of ignorance. So he's adhering to that Salafi, that Wahhabi position that was adopted by the official Saudi religious establishment to try to prevent internecine conflict over takfir. It didn't help because there was somebody named Ahmed al-Hazmi who kind of inserted into this tradition the idea that you have to do takfir of the so-called ʿAdhr, the one who does the excusing. This led to a whole internal battle over takfir. People were killing each other and struggling for who has power in the so-called delegated committee, which is kind of the executive committee of the group. And I could have gone through it at greater length, but the basic idea was that when all was said and done, they did announce the position that Turkī bin Ali had, which was that takfir is, as they kind of laid it out in a long audio series in 2017, they said takfir is not part of the foundation of the religion, but it is one of its requirements. What that means is if you do not engage in takfir, you are not kind of meeting the basic necessities of Islam. You're not adhering to the foundations of the religion. And therefore, al-ʿudhr bil-jahl can apply to one who does not, who is doing the excusing, etc. One can be excused for not pronouncing takfir on polytheists. I hope that was clear. So just in sum, if I have 30 seconds, there are sort of, that I have identified, that there are these two general approaches to al-ʿudhr bil-jahl in Salafī Islam. People who commit shirk may be excused on grounds of ignorance. That's the Taymiyyan approach. People who commit shirk may not be excused on grounds of ignorance. That is the Wahhabi approach. And then there is a further division that concerns those who refrain from takfir of polytheists. One of those says those people may be excused on grounds of ignorance, and the other says they may not be excused on grounds of ignorance. It's the first of these that has kind of been enshrined in both mainstream and the state Salafism and in jihadi Salafism. And with that, I will end.
Yes. I thought you might miss that. Thank you, Cole, for that incisive and clear presentation on a central issue in understanding Salafi jihadi, or as I would say, totalitarian Islamist thought. We now have what people at Quantico would call converging fires in the form of Dr. Daniel Law. I'm sorry, this does not show your first name, and I don't want to get it. Yes, it is right. Okay, so it's named after a prophet, so you just have to live up to your name. Dr. Daniel Law is a lecturer in Arabic language and literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, working primarily on Islamic theology, especially the Salafi tradition from Ibn Taymiyya to the present time. And he has produced thus far 2 books, Radical Islam and the Revival of Medieval Theology, and a forthcoming book on Salafi theology, both from Cambridge University Press. And his topic is the fine art of popularization. Ibn al-Wahhāb as a reader of Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya.
Thank you. And yes, I am named after the Prophet Daniel, but I don't think this is a lion's den. Hopefully it's a friendlier audience. So I will also be discussing Salafism. And when we consider Salafism, that is modern Salafism, as a broad socio-religious movement within Sunni Islam. I believe it is correct to view it as a modern development beginning in the 20th century, but one with a more or less direct genealogical predecessor in the Wahhabi movement in Arabia starting in the 18th century. As a school, however, Salafism as a school, in terms of its worldview and doctrine and theology and Islamic law, Salafism has much earlier roots, and we can speak of two different pre-modern strata of precedent that together provide the doctrinal bases for modern Salafism. Now, the basic ethos of Salafism can be traced back to the early Hanbali movement and the movement known as the al-Hadith, with which it was closely affiliated, that is, the people of the prophetic traditions. And these people are earlier than Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya. This basic ethos can be outlined in a few principles. We can start from the name Salafi itself, which derives from the word Salaf, meaning forefathers, and in our context, the righteous forefathers, who are usually identified as the first three generations of Islam. So a Salafi then is somebody who strives to adhere to what they conceive of as the original pure form of Islam of the Prophet Muhammad in the first generations before it became corrupted. Now, what do they mean by saying that Islam has become corrupted? In many ways, but for example, the promulgation of untrustworthy or fabricated hadith, that is, prophetic traditions that corrupt the hadith corpus, the expansive use of judicial opinion and analogy and casuistry at the expense of faithfulness or originalism to the texts of revelation, the innovation of speculative theology in Islam known as the kalam, and philosophical and mystical systems, and also forbidden innovations in ritual practice, and in particular the cult of saints, about which we have just heard and to which I'll be returning. So that is the early stratum, and for the early Hanbalis and the al-Hadith, faith was something to be nurtured in the heart, and it stood in no need of rationalist proof or defense. And in fact, they forbade disputation with heretical sects or heretical views, because they believed that these invented terminologies, these non-canonical discussions, were a snare, that once you entered them, even if you entered them with the intention to refute them, you could no longer escape afterwards. If you will, the Hotel California of theology. So that's the earliest stratum, but it only provides a partial account of the Salafi school, because the Salafis' formal theological doctrine does not derive, certainly not directly, from early Hanbalism or from the al-Hadith, but rather it was formulated by the 13th to 14th century Syrian Hanbali polymath Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyya, and to this day it is his writings and those of his students that serve as the touchstone of Salafi orthodoxy. So how did Ibn Taymiyya differ from this early stratum? First of all, he did in principle promote the same ethos that I have described. For example, if somebody brought up the corporeality or incorporeality of Allah, he would say, well, that is a non-canonical discussion because Revelation does not use the term jism, body, and so it neither affirms or refutes. But unlike his predecessors, Ibn Taymiyya would not stop there, and in fact he would then engage with the question very profoundly. And he did this with all of the major theological issues and with all of the major rivals, the Kalam theology of the Mu'tazili, Ash'ari, and Maturidi schools, the monist mystical system of the Andalusian mystic Ibn al-Arabi, the philosophy of Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, that is Avicenna and Averroes, and many, many less famous further figures in great detail and with astounding level of erudition. Now, how did he justify his departure from the old principle of not engaging with heretics? His basic explanation seems to be that the more correct approach simply did not work. In the generations preceding him, the Hanbali school had felt the siren call of systematic speculative theology, especially of the Ash'ari school, and so Ibn Taymiyya felt that a change in approach was needed in order to hold the line, and also to reach all of the other Muslims who he felt had gone down the wrong path. But the upshot of all of this is that Ibn Taymiyya's theology and doctrine look very different than earlier Hanbali doctrine, and first and foremost, he created a system. Okay, it's not a systematic theology in the same sense of the Kalam, but there is a very identifiable system, major themes, and the way they interact, and all of that is embedded in dialectical texture throughout his polemic with all kinds of different rivals. What he never did, though, was to extract this system and write it as a simple dogma, It always remains embedded in his polemics, and which are often rather abstruse and difficult to understand. And here is where modern Salafism differs from Ibn Taymiyya. In content, it does take its doctrine from the Taymiyyan system, but it does not perpetuate this dialectical spirit. And instead, it has taken a dogmatic turn. In other words, Ibn Taymiyya himself did not extract his system as a fixed dogma, but others after him did so. And the key figure in this turning point from dialectic to dogma is the 18th century founder of the Wahhabi movement, Ibn al-Wahhāb. And I believe this to be a critical point, and maybe this will help explain why I'm talking about what I'm talking about today. It's difficult to entertain the counterfactual, of course, of what if there had never been any Ibn al-Wahhāb in the Wahhabi movement, but the fact is that Ibn Taymiyya's writings were known for centuries before the advent of the Wahhabi movement, and while they did have some influence, maybe on fundamentalist trends, such as the Qadizadeli in the Ottoman Empire, we did not see the arising of any real Taymiyyan radical movements like the early Wahhabis and like the radical Salafis today. So I think it's fair to surmise that Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab's reformulation was something of a necessary condition for the emergence of radical Taymiyyan movements as we know them. So I would like to zoom in on the dynamics of this popularization project of Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab's, focusing on the most central feature of Taymiyyan theology, central and distinctive, a doctrine known as Tawhid al-Uluhiyya. And I'll describe it briefly, and then we'll try to look at how it changed in form between Ibn Taymiyya's original writings and Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. This doctrine of Tawhid al-Uluhiyya is the organizing axis of Ibn Taymiyya's entire system, and the basic idea is simple. He writes that the heart, the defining feature of Islam, is not conceptual monotheism, it is monolatry, that is the exclusive worship of one God alone to the exclusion of all others. So faith for him is not primarily a truth statement or a propositional attitude, i.e. that there is only one God, he is the sole creator and provider, and so on and so forth. He actually argued that the unbelievers described in the Quran also held that kind of conceptual monotheism, but they were still unbelievers. So the conceptual monotheism he calls Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, but he holds that even those who are monotheists in that sense, if they direct their forms of worship to other entities, even solely as intermediaries with Allah, then that is shirk, that is polytheism, and it is fact the main form of shirk that is described and denounced in the Quran. So for the Ibn al-Wahhab and the Wahhabi movement, they adopted this doctrine and became their real casus belli in a real-life war against the cult of saints, because if the dividing line between a Muslim and an unbeliever is not conceptual, but rather based on their religious praxis, then those who practice the cult of saints are simply not Muslims, right? The Muslim cult of saints is, for them, an oxymoron. So that is the principle of Tawhid al-Uluhiyya. And here it is in the credo of a Salafī jihadi organization from Gaza in 2009. The two is because this is the second article in their credo after a first article which describes, which promotes the basic Salafi ethos that I described before. And I'll read this out quickly. We believe that the foundation of the religion of Islam and its basis is twofold. First, the command to worship Allah alone without partner, to urge others to this, to found allegiance on this basis, and to declare unbelievers those who abandon it. And second, the prohibition of associating others with Allah in worship, to be harsh in upholding this prohibition, to found enmity on this basis, and to declare unbelievers those who do this. Okay, so we can see that this principle of Tawhid al-Uluhiyya is alive and well in modern Salafi jihadi organizations, and I won't get into all of the details of why exactly it's important for them beyond the war on the cult of saints, but we can see a good example here. Now, this wording is not Ibn Taymiyya's, but it's also not original. This wording is from an epistle, an 18th century epistle by Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. So they have taken his expression of the principle of Tawhid al-Uluhiyya or monolatry as is. So here I'd like to call attention to the manner in which Ibn al-Wahhab reached these sort of formulations on the basis of the Taymiyyan material. And the best angle through which to trace that is to address, simply enough, Ibn al-Wahhab as a reader of Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya. And I don't just mean here tracing the Taymiyyan themes in his works, which is something that I also do, but I mean something more specific. We know of at least 3 relevant works, there are more works, but 3 relevant to our topic, that Muhammad ibn ʿabd al-Wahhāb authored that are in what is known as the mukhtasar genre. That is a scholarly abridgment of a work by somebody else. So he wrote 2 scholarly abridgments of Ibn Taymiyya, the Mukhtasar al-Iman al-Kabir and Mukhtasar al-Iman al-Awsat, or al-Sarir. And he also wrote an abridgment of a work by Ibn Taymiyya's student, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, al-Sawā'iq al-Mursala. And so there, and I'm only giving a first approach here because there's a lot of work to be done to see exactly what he included and what he left out. But here I will give an example of that based on a 4th document, which is what I call Ibn Taymiyya's, Ibn ʿabd al-Wahhab's Taymiyyan notebook. Instead of being an abridgment of an entire work, it's a collection of passages from various places that Ibn ʿabd al-Wahhab copied out and summarized from Ibn Taymiyya's writings. This, from the manuscript, it was published in the 13th volume in the Saudi edition of Ibn ʿabd al-Wahhab's collected writings, and the editors did not make an attempt to indicate the Taymiyyan sources of this notebook. So I focused on one entry which deals well with the topic of Tawhīd al-Uluhiyyah, entry number 92, and found that it's abridged from 2 passages toward the end of Ibn Taymiyya's treatise, Iqtidā Sirat al-Mustaqim. And the value of this procedure is simply that it allows us to show the different levels of redaction of Salafi doctrine, from the Taymiyyan text to the Taymiyyan notebook, what was left out entirely, what was abridged, and then we can also contrast that with the way that Ibn ʿabd al-Wahhab writes about it in his own voice, in his own writings, which hopefully I'll have time to show you briefly at the end of my talk. So here, just to give an idea, is the text of Ibn Taymiyya's treatise, Iqtidā Sirat al-Mustaqim, and I've highlighted what went into Ibn ʿabd al-Wahhab's synopsis, and what is not highlighted was left out, just to give you some idea. But let's start from the first level, matters that Ibn ʿabd al-Wahhab excluded entirely, which he felt were irrelevant to his project, which once again was to transform this into a mass doctrine that would enlist people into the fight against the cult of saints. One thing that he left out from this passage is a standard Taymiyyan ontological position on the status of universals. Right? This is an old question that goes back to Plato and Aristotle, but Ibn Taymiyya believes it important because it is primarily a critique of the monist mysticism of Ibn al-Arabi, his assertion that Allah is existence per se, but that goes also for Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and other ontological formulations of theology. And Ibn Taymiyya denies that universals have any ontological reality. He believes that they are simply mental constructions that are born in the mind out of comparison between particulars. So whiteness per se, water per se, none of those things actually exist, and likely existence per se. So he argues against all of these, against Ibn al-Arabi and the likes of him, that if you say that Allah is existence per se, you're saying that he doesn't exist. Okay? Ibn ʿabd al-Wahhab, not interested in this topic. It's too far afield for him to, he's not engaging in theoretical matters. He wants to motivate people to action. Okay. The next level is what is included in the Taymiyyan notebook, but which, as far as I've been able to determine, Ibn ʿabd al-Wahhab never writes about in his own voice. Okay, so it's important for him, enough for him to copy, and it shows his awareness of this form of, this dialectical form of expression of Tawhīd al-Uluhiyyah, but it's not something that he writes in his own epistles. Okay, and we can see that the general thrust of this passage is to say is critique of people who misunderstand the meaning of Tawhid. And for Ibn Taymiyya specifically, he held that everybody else focused on conceptual monotheism, on Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, and they're completely unaware that Islam is really about exclusivity of worship, really Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah. So I'll skip to C here. These are letters that I've added, they aren't in the original. Another group supposed that the meaning of Tawhid is affirmation of Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, that is conceptual monotheism, and no more, and that they wrote at great length in investigation of this topic, whether through the proof that participation of 2 Rabbs, that is 2 gods, necessarily entails deficiency in the ability of one or both, and that it is impossible for both of the divine agents to be autonomous in action, or by another proof. Okay? So if you're reading Ibn Taymiyya and you're familiar with Ibn Taymiyya, you understand what this means, but I imagine that if you're not familiar with the proof from mutual obstruction, that this might be a little bit obscure. This is a kalam proof, that is a proof from speculative theology, that there is only one God. It is not the classic proof of God's existence, it is the proof that in number God can only be one. And the idea is this, that in order to be considered God, one needs to be omnipotent. Right? So let us suppose then, the counterfactual, that there are two gods, and then they would both have to be omnipotent. But what if one wanted that a certain individual live, and the other wanted that the certain individual died, right? Either they're both omnipotent, but that cannot be because the same person cannot be alive and dead at the same time. Or neither of them is omnipotent, and therefore neither of them is God. Or one of them is omnipotent, and the other is not. But if so, that is the conclusion that we've been seeking, that there can only be one God. Okay, so that is the classic kalam proof from mutual obstruction, and we can see that it deals with tawhid al-rububiyyah, right? What are the objective characteristics of God, and not with the issue of worship of God. Okay, so Ibn Taymiyya, his characteristic rejoinder to this, he points out that the kalam theologians associated with this proof, with this rational proof, a Quranic verse, Quran 21:22, لَوْ كَانَ فِيهِمَا آلِهَةٌ إِلَّا اللَّهُ لَفَسَدَتَا. That is, had there been in the heavens and earth gods other than Allah, both would have fallen into a state of corruption. And Ibn Taymiyyah, being the originalist that he is, he says this verse has nothing to do with that proof from mutual obstruction. First of all, because the term used for gods in it is aliha, the plural of ilah, right? Which is just like in Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, ilah is a specific name of God that means God as an object of worship. So what the verse is actually saying is that if there were objects of worship in the heavens and earth other than Allah, then that will engender corruption. Okay? That is, that the earth, that humans are not rightly, when humans are not rightly oriented, then that corrupts the heavens and the earth themselves. Has nothing to do with Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, it has to do with Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah and exclusivity of worship. And then indeed, they knew not that the Arab polytheists affirmed this Tawhid. This is what I said before, that for Ibn Taymiyya and for Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhāb, conceptual monotheism is not the major criterion of faith because they believe that the mushrikun, the polytheists in the Quran, also believed in only one God as creator and so forth. Their problem was that they worshipped other entities as intermediaries with this God. Okay? No, that's fine. It is an element of the required tawhid, but it does not deliver one from polytheism, which is the worst of sins. Rather, one must make one's religion exclusive to Allah, and the meaning of ilah, this is the issue that I've just mentioned, is object of worship. Okay, yeah, I'm almost done. So that's about it. We see what's been excluded, or examples of what's been excluded, what was included, but which Ibn Abdul Wahhab doesn't write about in his own voice, in his own epistles. And here is how Ibn Abdul Wahhab does write about the same issue of Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah. This is his treatise al-Qawaid al-Arba, and it's only 4 principles, and after each one is a Quranic verse, which because of lack of time I haven't included. But note that in format, that harkens back to the early Hanbalis, the early al-Hadith. He's not talking about the Kalam, and he's not talking about Ibn al-Arabi. He's stating simple principles as a dogma with canonical support from the Quran. Know that the unbelievers against whom the Prophet of Allah fought, may Allah's blessing and peace be upon him, affirmed that Allah the Exalted is the creator and director of the cosmos, and this did not make them Muslims. And this is a theory that conceptual monotheism is not sufficient to guarantee one's status as a Muslim. The unbelievers say, we only beseech and turn to other objects of worship in order to seek proximity to Allah and intercession. Okay. The Prophet, may Allah's blessing and peace be upon him, triumphed over people who differed one from another in their worship. Some worshipped angels, and others the prophets and righteous people, that is, a cult of saints. Some worshipped tree and stones, and others worshipped the sun and the moon. The Prophet, Allah's prayer and peace be upon him, fought them all and made no distinctions among them. And then leading up to what is always on Ibn Abdul Wahhab's mind, the practical implications for his situation in 18th century Arabia, the polytheism of the polytheists in our day, that is, the practitioners of the cult of saints, is worse than that of the ancients. The latter would worship others in time of ease, but would worship Allah exclusively when times of hardship came around, whereas the polytheists in our day remain in their polytheism both in times of ease and in hardship. So we can see that the same person who wrote this is aware of the very many layers and the intellectual twists and turns of the classic doctrine of Tawhid al-Uluhiyya, but in a very important stage in the development of Salafism over the centuries, that it has here been whittled down into a dogma that is appropriate for mass consumption. Thank you.
And lastly, we have Dr. Jeffrey R. Macris, the Deputy Director of the James Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy, and also a member of the Academy's History Department teaching Middle East history. His teaching covers both leadership and ethics and the Middle East. He's worked primarily on the Arab states of the Gulf and other activities in the Gulf region in modern times. And his paper today is on the 1834 assassination of the Saudi Imam Turkī as told by Ibn Bishr.
Thanks very much, Don. Our Navy JAGs require me to open any public statements with the disclaimer down at the bottom. The opinions here represent those of me alone and not necessarily those of the U.S. government, the U.S. Naval Academy, or the U.S. Navy. So I've been studying the Gulf region for over 2 decades. It's mostly been the relationship of the great powers in the Gulf and how the two have interfaced. About a decade ago, I became interested more deeply in the broader history of Saudi Arabia, specifically the period of the 1800s. There's not a deep historiography on that period. Probably still the best resource is this 1960s text by a gentleman named Bailey Winder called Saudi Arabia in the 19th Century. The more I read, the more I came across references to two Saudi writers, chroniclers of the Wahhabi story, Ibn Ghanam and Ibn Bishr. And the citations tended to be the same ones. They were in Arabic, and I began to try to pull the string of where a translation is of these two big texts. And they are big, you know, somewhere between 180 and 220,000 words, I think, for each one. And I realized that there really wasn't one in existence. And so, you know, my Arabic is okay. It's mostly contemporary media Arabic. I didn't have the tools to go into 19th century Arabic writing. So I've assembled a team of some professional native proficiency Arabic speakers, and we've begun to translate the Ibn Bishr piece. So my paper topic today is the 1834 assassination of Saudi Imam Turkī, as told by Ibn Bishr. And I picked it because there's really not a lot written about the 1800s or 19th century Saudi history. And the assassination here foreshadows problems within the Saudi family that will ultimately doom the second dynasty or the second kingdom or the second state. So today what I'd like to do in my time here is really 4 main ideas. Number one, I'd like to give a short review of where the second state fits into the broader history of Saudi Arabia. Number two, talk a little bit more about Ibn Bishr as a chronicler and his work. Number three, and perhaps the most interesting part, or what I found the most interesting part, is what contemporary Saudi historians think about the historiography of Ibn Bishr, and a contemporary desire really to put it in the margins and not really look at it anymore. And then finally, I want to read some passages, because I think for Western ears, this is the first time that, that this broader story has been translated into English. So one, the 3 Saudi states. Perhaps some of you, this is a simplistic overview. Perhaps some of you, it's the first time you've seen it. But the history of Saudi Arabia, that has stretched now for nearly three centuries, can be divided into three different phases. In red is the first Saudi dynasty, right? Whoop. Yeah, there it is. Right here, Mohammed bin Saud founded the first Saudi dynasty in his union with the preacher that we've heard quite a bit here today, Muhammad bin al-Wahhāb. Wahhab had attempted to spread his Puritan message in several different places throughout the Arabian Peninsula for a better part of a decade, but never really found fertile ground. But in an aggressive and forward-looking prince named Mohammed bin Saud, the two formed a union that has continued in three different permutations down to today. The first kingdom ends when the spread of Wahhabism begins to threaten the outlying and surrounding powers. The Ottoman Empire, with its leader in Egypt, Muhammad Ali, sends a force into the Arabian Peninsula and destroys the Saudi Wahhabi Union and their capital of Diriyah in 1818. And that might have been the end of the story. Many of the theologians and many of the Saudi princes were carted off and sent into exile in Cairo. In a manner that still is not particularly well told and may never be well told, Prince Turkī here, right, a cousin of Abdullah, who's executed in Istanbul, escapes, and he comes back. And Diriyah is destroyed, but working out of Riyadh, he begins to recreate the Saudi state in ways that are very germane to the desert ways of doing business, right? One-on-one relationships with other princes, with force, with violence, but still that union between the Saudi power and the Wahhabi theology existed, right? This second kingdom then that Turkey will start will continue down through the 1890s, right here, and will eventually, due to infighting between the Saudi royal family, and you'll see all of these different changes of power here representing a power struggle between sons, descendants of Prince Turkī, will result in a rival family from up north, the Rashidi family, taking power. And then eventually, King Abdulaziz, better known in the West as Ibn Saud, will come out of exile in Kuwait and will begin the modern or third iteration of the Saudi state. He had many sons, right? Over 50 legitimate sons. One of the last and oldest of those sons is Salman, who's still in power. And we think, although it's not a fait accompli, that perhaps his son Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, will take over at Salman's death. Although there are a number of people with knives out for Mohammed bin Salman, so I don't know. We'll see what happens. So back to the story then of Turkey. Turkey ends up getting assassinated by a disgruntled cousin named Mashari. If you go back to his great-grandfather Saud, the founder of modern Saudi Wahhabi movement, it's Muhammad's brother, grandson, right? So that's number one, a short review of the three Saudi states or kingdoms. Part two of what I'd like to talk about is a little review of Ibn Bishr himself. And here I'll begin to go to some of the passages from the paper that I submitted here. So Ibn Bishr hailed from Central Arabia, from the Najd period. He was born in one of the primary states, cities, I guess, in the region, Jalajal, we think, in about the mid-1790s, 1795. In about, when he was in his mid-teens, in 1809, he moved to Diriyah, which had not yet been destroyed by the Ottoman Egyptians. It's the capital, as we said before, the first Saudi state, where he studied, we think, under one of the two chroniclers, Ibn Ghanam. He digested and ingested some of the Wahhabi doctrine, much of which we've heard of from the other two co-presenters. Turkey's son Faisal, after Turkey's assassination, will commission Ibn Bishr to write another history of the people. So as historians, we need to keep in the back of our mind that Ibn Bishr, although his account remains one of the best eyewitness accounts of the second Saudi dynasty, he is both a believer and he is an actor in the process, and also he's on the payroll of the Saudi family himself. So we do need to keep that in the back of our mind, that there's all the reason in the world for him to portray issues in a not so objective light, although he claims in his writing to be doing just that, sort of a modern day Thucydides. So he writes his piece that he entitles A Symbol of Glory in the History of Najd. He draws upon Ibn Ghanam, he draws upon others as well, including Ibn Labun. We think that the story was written sometime between 1830 and 1850s, and the account ends in the 1850s itself. Ibn Bishr divides his work into four parts. The life and teachings of Muhammad bin Abd al-Wahhab. Part A. Part B is the expansion and the consolidation of the Wahhabi state. Part C is the violent response of the Ottoman Empire to the growth of the Wahhabi state in the early 1800s. And then finally, and this really gets into the part that I'm talking about today, Ibn Bishr writes about the revival and the restoration of the Wahhabi state under Turkī bin Abdullah and then later Faisal ibn Turkī. So before I start reading some of the passages from the texts that surround the assassination, my third point I'd like to talk about for a few moments today is the revisionist history that's going on today, right now, within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. One would think that such a seminal document would be warmly welcomed within contemporary Saudi historians community, but really that's not the case. Mohammed bin Salman, who you hear much about in the public press, has made a concerted effort to try to reframe Saudi historiography away from some of the excesses of Muhammad bin Abd al-Wahhab and the Wahhabi movement, and more toward what I would say is a nationalist interpretation or a family-oriented interpretation, where if you go to some of the museums now, you read very, very little about Muhammad bin Abd al-Wahhab, but it's about the great people that you see up here in red and blue and in green. And in some sidebar conversations I had with some university professors who had been engaged with Mohammed bin Salman's attempt to rewrite the K-12 and the university curriculum, I asked him about my attempt to translate Ibn Bishr, and in so many words he said, "We aren't interested in helping out with that at all." Why? Because it really brings up the excesses of the Saudi regime. It brings up the radical Islamic past, and Mohammed bin Salman's attempt is to reorient the kingdom toward a different, more secular direction, more secular future. And these scholars made particular attention to point out the fact that the Mutawwa, the religious police, who had for decades enforced praxis, who had enforced uniform practices of the believers, they had lost their rental cars and been given to the camel exhibition organizers. So there's something very different going on in terms of historiography in the kingdom today with Ibn Bishr and telling the story of the 1800s, and the Wahhabi movement is very much not popular today. So in my remaining time, what I'd like to do is read a few passages from the text to give you a story of what's in Ibn Bishr's chronicle as it surrounds the beginning of the restoration of Saudi rule on the Arabian Peninsula and what's going on. So the first couple of pages are from the beginning of Volume 2, and it has to do with Ibn Bishr's description of the societal decay that in Ibn Bishr's mind took place after the Ottoman Egyptians' destruction of Dur'iyya and the end of the Puritan movement of the Wahhabi believers. So I'll quote here. This is from volume 2, page 6. The system of community, as well as the customs of compliance and obedience, decayed. The sparks of disputes began to fly in those nations, and the distances between them could not be reconciled. The Egyptian armies wreaked havoc upon them, meaning the believers, killing many valiant men. They seized all the money that the inhabitants of the lands owned. The depraved ones, meaning the Egyptians, razed the gardens as well. They destroyed the tall castles, and the people of Nejd became debased as they obtained the humiliating status of slaves. Their scholars, the Wahhabi scholars, became dispersed, having to choose between exile and homelessness. Disputes, ordeals, killing, and fighting raged in most of the communities. That which is wrong was not forbidden, and that which was right was not enjoined. Many of them avoid praying and fasting during Ramadan. Music and singing filled the assemblies, and the offspring of the defeated stopped attending the mosques and schools. The councils no longer heeded the call to prayer, and scholarly inquiries about the principles of Islam and the forms of worship were eliminated. Paganism appeared across the whole land, and the people advocated for it in public. So, in Ibn Bishr's mind, the collapse of the first Saudi state here in 1818 and the 5 intervening years before Turkey's ascension as the second Imām, or the second religious political leaders, was a period of great chaos and catastrophe for the believers. Well, the Ottoman Egyptians exiled a number of princes and theologians, and I'll read a passage here from page 25 of volume 2 that talks about the welcome that some received in Central Arabia when they came back from Egypt. So in that year, 1241 Hijra, or 1825, Mashari, the one who will eventually assassinate his cousin, Mashari bin Abdul Rahman bin Mashari bin Saud came, having escaped from Egypt. He went to his maternal uncle, Imām Turkī, right, in Riyadh. And there, Turkey gave him a generous welcome and provided him with bountiful gifts and appointed him prince of the town of Manfuha, right? So Ibn Bishr is painting this story of Mashari being greeted with open arms by Turkey. And of course, Ibn Bishr is writing this several decades after the assassination, so one might expect that he would be trying to paint a positive portrayal of Turkey, right? And Ibn Bishr continues then on page 50 of why Mashari is growing angry at Turkey. It really is never unclear, but he attempts to address that question. So, in the month of Sha'ban in 1830, Common Era, Imām Turkī went with his soldiers toward the north, and he was informed that his paternal cousin Mashari, along with some of his attendants, had left Riyadh full of anger at Turkey. And so Turkey returned to his homeland and granted permission to the peoples of the far reaches of his domain to return to their homelands as well. As for Mashari, when he fled Riyadh, he found Mandil, head of the al-Malat tribe, or sub-tribe of the Mu'tair. Mashari found him and his Bedouin tribesmen, and so Mashari requested his support in a vendetta against Turkey, but the other refused, right? So Mashari continues several times to try to find people to go up and rise up against his cousin. And then on page 64, Ibn Bishr continues, Mashari betrayed his uncle Turkey, and may Allah the Almighty have mercy on him, by meeting with people from among Turkey's subjects and contracting them to kill him. And when this occurred, Turkey began to suspect these people, so he expelled those individuals among them who resisted his rule. And then I'll finish up with a couple of passages that talk about the assassination itself. Mashari assassinated his uncle with the help of some depraved men who were among the basest of the servants. They promised one another to betray Turkey after the Friday prayer upon his departure from the mosque. For when he attended the Friday prayer, his routine following the prayer would consist of departing from the door located to the south of the mihrab. The door had been installed in the qibla wall of the mosque to facilitate the entry and exit of the imam without drawing the congregation's attention. The traitors were lying in wait among the shops in the market and between the fortress and the mosque. In his hand was a piece of writing that he was reading, and on his left hand was a man. He was intercepted by a servant, an attendant named Ibrahim bin Hamza, and Ibrahim burst into the scene carrying a pistol, taking Imam Turkī by surprise. He shot the imam, who fell down to the ground dead. Mashari had just emerged from the mosque at the moment, so he brandished his sword and threatened and intimidated the people. Several other individuals also brandished their swords with him, and thus the people became aware of the plot that had just been carried out. Well, the end of the story is Mashari makes a claim to become imam himself. And in the intervening weeks, Turkey's son, Faisal, is alerted by Turkey's servant, who rushes down to Al-Assa, down by Bahrain and the eastern provinces. Faisal puts together a fighting force. They come back to Riyadh. Mashari hides out in one of the forts in Riyadh, and eventually the Saudi family will prevail again. Mashari is killed, his head severed and paraded in town, and thus begins the rule of Faisal. So with that, we'll end the comments. The four things I wanted to talk about here was a short review of the three different kingdoms of the Saudi state. Number one. Number two, a short review of Ibn Bishr and his work. Number three, what Ibn Bishr's work means to contemporary Saudi historians, which is really an attempt to put it in the closet and not really look at it that much. And then finally, some passages directly from this translation of Ibn Bishr. So thanks very much.